Today we are hitting episode 2 with Dr. Barry Davis, who will be releasing a book on May 5th called The Preventioneers. He has taken what could have been a very dull subject and written a dynamite book on it. You know that I like stories, and he has woven some powerful stories around this theme. In episode 1, we talked about two of the preventioneers, Benjamin Franklin and Dr. Semmelweis of hand washing fame. And now in episode 2, we are going to continue with that. Doctor, could you just give us a brief intro as to why this book and why you decided to read it, or to write it, better said?
Well, a couple of reasons. One was this was right at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, and I couldn't understand why we couldn't prevent things. I mean, we had this incredible amount of knowledge about preventing infectious diseases. Granted, this was a new disease, but we had prepared all along. There was all these pandemic preparedness things within the government, and we had the CDC was the best in the world. Why did this keep going? And I couldn't understand it. And I thought more deeply about it. I said, well, maybe if we look back in history, we can see why people had a hard time trying to convince others to prevent things. And then, my career was all about prevention. I was involved in all of these hypertension trials, which, the main goal is to find ways to better prevent the serious outcomes of hypertension. And then I decided to do this, that the best way to do it was sort of what you said, which is I could write a book about prevention and go into charts and figures and analyses and all that, and it would reach a very limited audience. But I wanted to find a way to reach a larger audience. So I ended up examining different people. I had a whole list of people. I had to cut it down. But I decided this was the best way to tell stories that would captivate people, engage them, make them want to understand. And when it all comes together, they could possibly see the pattern that I saw as I was writing.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Now, to some of our listeners, I just want to give a brief background. The great New York Yankee catcher Yogi Berra, who had a great saying for everything, had one of my favorites: "It ain't bragging if you can do it." So we're talking today with an MIT undergrad, a Brown University PhD, and a medical degree from UC San Diego, plus decades of experience at the highest levels of academic research. So we've got an expert with us today, and I'm looking forward to digging in on some more of the stories. Talk to us about why you chose auto safety as one of your next stories.
Well, I've gone through a big list, and that's a well-known thing in public health about auto safety. And the reason it's well known is because that's the kind of thing where it was a design issue that was finally used to solve a problem. But I said, well, where did these people come up with this? How did this happen? And I did a little more research and find out that there were many, many, many people involved in all of these endeavors. But there was a group of doctors from varied backgrounds that were involved in this. The one thing I'll say in most of, if not all, the Preventioneers stories is they saw this harm or this preventable harm that I talk about. They saw about it because they either lived there, like Franklin lived through fires, or in the case of the auto safety doctors, they dealt with patients. They saw the incredible damage that they came through. There were 5 of them. One was a plastic surgeon, so obviously you'd see stuff to work on after an accident. Another was an ENT guy, who obviously you'd see that too because of the mouth and the face. And then another one was a neurosurgeon, affects the brain. And then another one was a police surgeon, but you'd see that because he'd be called to the site of the accident. And the last one was the most interesting one because he was an Air Force surgeon. But he saw that because of his dealings with uh, deceleration and acceleration in planes, but he transferred that knowledge to cars.
Wow. And that brings what pattern? That's an incredible question that prompts something or statement that prompts a question in my mind. I always am amazed by people who are able to be familiar with something, an F-35 fighter that goes from 0 to Mach in a matter of seconds, acceleration, deceleration. Did you see any pattern of those that could, this works here, this applies here, how could it work there? What was the bridge that caused that question and result to happen?
You mean just with the auto safety doctors or in general?
Just in general.
Oh yeah. So they again, this is this pattern that goes throughout the book. They see the harm, they search for a cause, they can come up with a cause, and they have to find a way to translate that. In the case of the auto safety doctors, well, in the case of this person, his name is John Stapp, Arnold John Stapp, probably well known in his field and around the world. His face appeared on the cover of Time magazine because he was known as the fastest man on Earth. He was the guy that went in those rocket sleds that went up to 700 miles an hour.
On the salt flats?
Yes.
Okay.
And his whole body would rattle. But they realized that, they come up with the idea of seatbelts so that when you stop suddenly that you don't get thrown. And several people realized, well, you should apply this to cars. Um, there were there was a thing about cars at the very beginning. When the cars first came out, there was no such thing as safety glass. And it didn't take long before people realized that maybe we should replace the glass so that bad things didn't happen.
Yeah.
But these doctors, all of them, they saw these injuries and they realized what was going on, let alone the deceleration, so they should wear a seatbelt. But they were hitting things in the car. You were hitting the dashboard, you were hitting the steering wheel. Um, Something was going on, and they looked at the steering wheel, and they looked at the dashboard, and the dashboard had all these buttons on it, and the buttons used to pop out. And they said, well, and the board in there, I don't think they had those kind of flexible rubber kind of boards that we have now.
Hmm.
Person hits that, boom. So maybe we should do something about that, make it more protective. In fact, one of the doctors outfitted his own protection for his own car. He showed his neighbors how to do it.
Mm-hmm.
But then they each individually, and then at the end, some of them as a group, they had to convince others through various means that this was the way to do it. They really tried hard with the car companies, with the medical societies. They wrote about it. They talked about it. And it took years, but eventually something was done.
How did they sell it to Detroit? Because none of this was cheap.
Well, actually, one of the guys, I think it was Dr. Strait, sold it to. There's a famous automobile company called Tucker Automobile, and there was a famous movie made about it.
Mm-hmm.
Preston Tucker. He
Yeah.
convinced them, and he went and worked with them and so on, and they started to introduce some of these things, but unfortunately, their cars went out of business.
Yeah.
So they had to convince others. That was the biggest problem. Was companies thought it was going to be very expensive to do this, and they didn't want to make changes that would cause the price of their cars to rise, even though it would have an amazing effect on saving lives and injury. And eventually it took the government to make the companies do it.
Got it. So have you seen a pattern of behavior and thinking that our listeners could benefit from as to when you know that you have an idea that is necessary, that will save lives. Dr. Semmelweis obviously did not get that lesson that you can't insult people and expect them to like your idea, as you described. But any items, because I run into this all the time in my consulting work with somebody, oh, it's a great idea, Carl, but we're not going to be able to convince the VP or this chief medical officer. Any thoughts of the resilient on keeping resilient while you help the other side see that your point is not only valuable but is life-saving?
Well, one of the biggest things that I keep telling people is prevention saves lives, protects health, and saves money. It's incredible how much a dollar invested in prevention can save them so much money at the end. Um, whether you talk about the cars, well, yeah, they probably had to do that stuff, but the insurance industry and the medical industry saves all this money from preventing a terrible accident uh, and the consequences of it. But hypertension, you treat hypertension, you prevent a stroke or a heart attack or other kinds of damage, which is very expensive down the road, as treating hypertension is just
Mhm.
so minimal. Um, yeah, so you have to. I understand what you're saying is that people are resistant, and that goes throughout the book,
Mhm.
whether it's institutional resistance or commercial resistance or professional resistance or some sort of social resistance. Resistance, resistance, resistance. The pattern just appears all across the book.
Mhm.
And, it's interesting how people overcame that. I mean, in the case of the auto safety doctors, they would go to meetings, they'd write papers, they present, they try and enlist people. Some of them were able to enlist like a senator or a congressman. Uh, they just persisted and persisted and persisted to try to get their message out. And if it didn't fell on deaf ears, they'd come back a little bit and then try again and try again. And they would form groups. Uh, Medical societies had these groups dealing with oil safety. And eventually they got through. Sometimes you have to have a champion. I think in the case of the oil safety, the champion ended up being somebody like Ralph Nader. But somehow you can get through. Uh, in the case of, um, there's another person in the book, Sarah Josephine Baker, who was the
Exactly
first,
where I was going next.
is the first woman head of a child bureau in public health. Uh, she was a person way ahead of her time. But she just persisted. She wouldn't be held back no matter what they said. I mean, she faced a lot of gender resistance because she was a woman, but she would not be held back. She persisted. She wanted to help people. She had the experience of working through the tenements of New York City, and she couldn't understand why all this was happening. And she, like Semmelweis, had an epiphany one day where she realized that, hey, why don't we prevent this from happening instead of waiting for it to.
Mhm.
And she did a lot of work and worked with a lot of well-known people in the health department in New York City, and was able to work her way through and convince people. She was also like, in a way, sort of like Franklin, who had this platform. She was very media savvy. She was interviewed by the New York Times, I don't know how many times. This is in the early 20th century. And she convinced people right and left that this was the right thing to do. Convinced the bosses, the public, and she made things happen. Sometimes it's a
So
force of personality.
yes, and like you mentioned with, and I think in today's world with social media and the media, um, Franklin was 250 years ahead of his time by writing about his great ideas. And it's interesting that Dr. Baker did that same thing. So a little historical context here for my next subject. My wife loves to watch old movies, and many times when I walk through the room where she's watching it, the stars are smoking and everyone's smoking. I remember, and this dates me a bit, but I remember watching TV at my grandparents' house, and right in the middle of very neutral programming would be Winston cigarettes, showing, this couple out on the beach, just healthy smoking. And, 20, 30 years later, those very successful tobacco companies are paying exorbitant lawsuits because they were killing people. So, how did the Preventioneers come in with something that was societally strong? It is accepted to smoke. Um, I remember flying on business at the beginning of my career. The first 20 seats of a 727 were um, non-smoking, and the back was smoking, as if that helped anything. you know? But we thought it was good. So talk to us a bit about how that mindset shifted fairly rapidly for society.
Well, yes and no. It didn't shift. The society shifted, but the tobacco industry didn't.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, it took a while. I mean, back in the 50s, there were two articles that appeared simultaneously. Well, the same year. One appeared in the Journal of the American Medical Association. One appeared in the British Medical Journal, um, showing strong links between smoking and lung cancer. It's not. It wasn't a clinical trial. It was a study, well documented with some controls in it, but it wasn't like the ultimate in evidence. And in
Mhm.
fact, in the 50s, clinical trials weren't the ultimate in evidence either because they weren't done that much. Um, but it took some persistence upon the people, these kind of researchers, to do more research, gather more evidence, uh, present. And eventually, the Surgeon General's report came out, and that sort of shifted things. But they were fighting the tobacco industry.
Mhm.
And the tobacco industry was all powerful. They had their hands in everything. All they had to do was create doubt. Well, it could be maybe it's just an association. Maybe it's not the cause. We need more evidence. We should probably do some more research. We'll actually fund the research, and so on and so on and so on. And in fact, there is a well-known book called The Merchants of Doubt, which features the tobacco industry among others. All they had to do was create some doubt, and they had massive uh, funds
Yeah.
to keep going. Um, and the people who are featured in the book, were very persistent. It wasn't only them that had this thing that convinced others. It was getting the public on their side and the government finally on their side to create laws to do stuff. And the smoking rate has gone down dramatically. What just disappoints me is that it's not disappeared altogether.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, if you think about it, I realize that people who smoke, and I mentioned this in the chapter, they derive some pleasure from it.
Hmm.
Um, but the consequences are terrific. I mean, smoking is the most preventable form of cancer.
Yeah. And yet people still buy cigarettes.
Yes, they do, because it's not in law yet that it's a product you can prohibit. Although it could end up being like alcohol, because if you prohibit it, it just goes to the black market.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So the next topic is one that you have spent much of your career in. As a huge fan of World War II history, how you started this chapter instantly was wow, especially when the doctor commented, or one phrase in that chapter was one the curiosity of what would have been different if this one hypertension situation had been prevented. And it was the death of Franklin Delano Roosevelt in spring of 45. And so much of post-war, what would have been different if we'd had that diplomatic genius in the saddle? Nothing against Truman, but FDR had some incredible talents. Talk to us about hypertension and all your work there and why you chose this as a topic for Preventioneers.
Well, it was easy for me to choose it as a topic because I'm involved in it.
Yeah.
And I was involved at the very end of one of the landmark premier clinical trials in hypertension. It's called the Hypertension Detection and Follow-up Program. I met all the giants in the field when I first started. But then I got involved in other very important clinical trials. But I decided that at the very end of the chapter, I might mention something about my involvement, but at the beginning, I wanted to concentrate on somebody who was premier in promoting the clinical trial for hypertension, somebody who worked really hard at it. And I thought about, what's the way to start the chapter? And I remembered that what happened to FDR, and then I researched some more. And amazingly, the doctor that took care of him at the end wrote his clinical notes up as a medical paper. And he gave great detail in the paper. You can literally, if you read his clinical paper, you can sort of see what's happening to Franklin Delano Roosevelt at the very end. He's just having tremendous problems breathing, moving, coping. And it's just his last couple of hours wheezing. It's dramatic. But those days, there was really no great treatment for hypertension.
Mhm.
It was only afterwards that they started to develop this. And this one man, Edward Fries, went on this crusade to try and figure out a way to use drugs to lower the blood pressure. Now, he ran into a similar problem to Semmelweis because Semmelweis had this theory about what was causing the infection, well, the disease, but he didn't have the science behind it. He didn't know germ theory or anything. There was no science behind it. So the problem with hypertension, there was no particular science behind it at that time. Why should I lower the blood pressure? What would that do? What is this? What's the mechanism?
Mhm.
Well, it turns out in clinical trials, there's a whole bunch of times we don't know the exact mechanism, but we know something works. And use the method to do something that works. We'll spend time trying to figure out why it works, but we know that it works, so let's use it. So he investigated from one drug to another, to another, to another, as did others, and came up with a series of drugs that he was able to study through the Veteran Affairs system. He had a brilliant idea. He realized he needed statisticians, mathematicians to help him, and he got the best in the system. And he was able to design these very well controlled clinical trials to prove that lowering the blood pressure would reduce deaths and heart attacks and strokes.
So, what is the common thread of developing curiosity? Because I hear this coming up again. He wondered, she wondered. Any suggestions for people who might say, Carl, I'm just not naturally curious, but I'm hearing to be resilient, to be innovative. That's a character trait we've got to develop. Any thoughts on developing curiosity?
Yeah, well, a little bit. As I stated at the very beginning, is that all these people saw something wherever they worked or wherever they lived. Something was off, a little bit here, a little bit there. What I sort of call is they saw these signals. Something was not quite right. Why this happened, and then it happened again, and then it happened again. Why is it happening?
Mhm.
And that's where you might get curious about why is it happening,
Mhm.
and try and think about a way to investigate why it's happening or what could be causing it. But if something seems a little bit off in your daily life, even your own personal health, I mean, I tell people this all the time. They put off things. I haven't been feeling right for the last 3 months. Well, something's wrong. Um,
Mhm.
you need to investigate. At the very least, go to your doctor. Um, but people do this all the time. You have a car. Something's not quite right, or something's going wrong with the car when you're driving it. Something's going wrong when you start it up. And it's just once, okay. But if it happens again and again and again, something's not quite right. If a teacher in a class sees that the students aren't quite getting her lessons, she's tried
Mhm.
this, she's tried that, something's not right. She needs to more fully evaluate. Or he. Um, there's a whole host of things in life where you see things and you see them again and you see them again, and you need to realize that something's not quite right.
Excellent point. So I want to wrap us up with somewhat of a sobering topic. One of your chapters is on suicide. And this, of course, is someone who spent a lot of time with clients that were struggling. Fortunately, never lost one to suicide in my career, which I feel greatly blessed for. However, some statistics from 1965 to 1972, there were 58,220 combat fatalities in Vietnam. That comes out to a little over 8,300 deaths per year. The most recent statistic I could find for suicides was in 2022, where 49,500 in 1 year, a multiple of five, nearly, well, probably close to 6 times the amount of annual deaths in Vietnam we see every year in the United States. How can the preventioneer thinking start? Because all the chapters, problem and a huge step toward resolution. Hypertension's down, smoking's down, women in healthcare and maternity much better. Suicide is severe. Thoughts on how to look into that and use 250 years of background to move the needle here?
Well, yeah, there's a lot of things that can happen. We need to find a way to intervene on the path of what leads to suicide. And the chapter that I have is sort of at the very end of the path. They literally stop them from jumping off of a bridge or a cliff or something.
Mhm.
Obviously, if you could move it further back, identify who's at risk. When I go to my doctor nowadays, every fill out a form, they ask if I've had suicidal ideation.
Yeah.
Um,
Mhm.
so it could work better there. But one of the things that I wanted to bring out in the chapter was, okay, they stepped in at the end, or just before the end, but they were doing something called means control. They What were the means and how were they stopping it?
Mhm.
Now they were sort of human barriers to stopping it, but the best way to do it is they had a structural barrier. These bridges, these high spots, hot spots. Uh, if they had a barrier, people couldn't jump off of
Mhm.
the hot spot. You couldn't jump off the bridge or the cliff. In fact, the San Francisco Golden Gate Bridge just recently completed this big structural barrier. And I think since they've done that, I don't think they've had a death.
Mhm.
Um, but there are, it gets a little political here. I don't want to touch this. It's sort of like a loaded gun. But one of the biggest means or methods of suicide in the United States is guns.
Mhm.
People own guns.
Mhm.
And if we could find ways to do something about the methods, I don't necessarily mean that you don't allow people to buy guns, but makes it harder for them to utilize it in the way that they do.
Mhm.
I mean, for example, just off topic, it's not suicide, but in terms of protecting children, they have lock boxes.
Yep. Mhm.
Um, I mean, there are a lot of clever people out there who don't necessarily have the answer. But if you want to do harm reduction, prevent the means of doing this, so you want to intervene. And the other thing that was interesting in the chapter on suicide is that if somebody tries and there's an intervention and prevents them, they
Mhm.
don't necessarily try it again. and or try another way of doing it.
Yep. Absolutely.
So if we could find a way to at least intercept somewhere on the path, even if it's towards the very end, at least you stop it.
Absolutely. So to our listeners, May 5th is going to be the release date for the Preventioneers by Dr. Barry Davis. And just want to thank you, Doctor, for being with us. You mentioned at the beginning or at the end of our other episode, could you just refresh our listeners' memories here for how to best contact you if they have any reason to? I know you mentioned through your book publisher, John Hopkins Press, and on your
Right,
website.
right. But they can, you know, Google me and see my academic website. My email is on there.
Mhm.
Um, they can contact me that way.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Number one, for writing an incredibly innovative way to present this topic. And to our readers, having reviewed the pre copy, strongly suggest that you press that Amazon button somewhere on your computer. It's a must read. It's well written. Doctor, thanks for being with us today.
Well, thank you, Carl. I enjoyed it so much.